A Debt of Two Worlds.
France, 1918.
Nurse Evelyn Carter had treated Captain James Calloway for weeks, watched him fade, and finally held his hand as he passed.
She grieved.
She moved on. But 3 months later, another wounded soldier was brought in, his face battered, his uniform torn. And when she asked his name, he whispered, James Calloway. Chapter 1. The Ghost in the Ward. The air in the field hospital hung thick and heavy, a suffocating blend of antiseptic, blood, and the ever-present scent of damp earth that clung to everything in France. Evelyn Carter moved through the rows of cots, her footsteps muffled by the constant, low moan of pain that was the ward's perpetual soundtrack. Each breath was a conscious effort, rebellion against the exhaustion that gnawed at her bones. 3 years. 3 years she'd been tending the wounded, the broken, the dying, and still, the horror of it all never quite faded. It simply burrowed deeper, settling into the marrow like a chilling, persistent damp. She paused beside a young soldier, his face pale and drawn, his chest rising and falling with shallow, ragged breaths. Pneumonia. Another one. She adjusted his blanket, her fingers brushing against his feverish skin. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open, and for a moment, a flicker of lucidity shone through the haze of illness.
Mama?
He whispered, his voice barely audible. Evelyn smoothed his hair back from his forehead, a familiar pang of sorrow twisting in her chest. Rest now, soldier, she murmured, her voice soft and steady. You're safe. He closed his eyes again, his breathing easing slightly, and she moved on, the image of his young, vulnerable face imprinted on her mind. They were all so young. Too young. The flickering candlelight cast long, dancing shadows across the canvas walls of the tent, creating an eerie, almost surreal atmosphere. The wind howled outside, rattling the tent flaps and carrying with it the distant rumble of artillery fire, a constant reminder of the brutal reality that lay just beyond these fragile walls. It was a sound Evelyn had grown accustomed to, yet it still managed to send a shiver down her spine, a primal fear that never truly left her. She reached the end of the row and turned, her gaze sweeping across the ward. So many faces, so many stories, all ending here, in this makeshift haven of pain and fleeting hope. And then she saw him. He lay in a cot near the entrance, partially obscured by the shadows. He'd been brought in earlier that evening, another casualty of the relentless fighting near the Somme. She hadn't seen him clearly then, only caught a glimpse of his battered, blood-stained uniform as he was carried in, unconscious. But now, as the candlelight flickered across his face, she felt a jolt, a strange, unsettling sensation that made her heart skip a beat. She moved closer, her steps hesitant, her breath catching in her throat. His face was bruised and swollen, one eye swollen shut, but even through the damage, she recognized him. The shape of his jaw, the curve of his lips, the way his dark hair curled slightly at his temples, it was him.
It couldn't be.
It was impossible. Captain James Calloway, she whispered, the name a ghost on her lips. She had nursed Captain James Calloway for weeks, 3 months ago. She'd watched him fight, watched him fade, and finally, she'd held his hand as he took his last breath. She'd felt the life slip away from him, the warmth leaving his hand as his grip loosened. She'd closed his eyes, whispered a prayer, and grieved. She had moved on, as she always did, carrying the weight of his memory, along with countless others, in the silent chambers of her heart. But here he was, lying before her, breathing alive. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched his arm. His skin was warm, feverish, but undeniably real. He stirred, his eyelids fluttering, and he groaned softly. The sound was like a punch to her gut, a confirmation of the impossible. The other nurses were busy, tending to the constant influx of wounded. No one else seemed to notice the miracle, the resurrection, that was happening in their midst. Evelyn felt a wave of dizziness, a sense of unreality that threatened to overwhelm her. She gripped the edge of the cot, her knuckles white, trying to steady herself. He opened his eyes, the one that wasn't swollen shut, and looked at her. His gaze was unfocused, clouded with pain and confusion, but there was a flicker of something else there, a spark of recognition that sent a shiver down her spine. "Nurse?" he whispered, his voice hoarse and weak. "Yes," she replied, her voice trembling. "I'm here." He struggled to speak, his brow furrowed in concentration. "My name," he rasped. "What is my name?" Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of the ward. This was madness. This was a dream. A cruel, twisted dream. But the feel of his skin beneath her hand, the sound of his ragged breathing, the pain in his eyes, it was all too real. "Tell me," he pleaded, his voice barely a whisper. "Tell me who I am." She swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. She had to be strong. For him, for herself. She had to make sense of this impossible situation. She had to find out the truth. "Your name," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "is James Calloway. Captain James Calloway." His eyes widened slightly, and a flicker of something
Fear?
passed across his face. He closed his eyes again, his breathing becoming more labored, and he slipped back into unconsciousness. Evelyn stood there, frozen, staring at him, her mind reeling. The ghost in the ward had a name. And it was a name she knew, a name she had mourned, a name that shouldn't be here. She had to find out how this had happened, find some doctor. But a small voice within her, one which sounded suspiciously like fear, was starting to wonder if finding out was a truly good idea. Chapter 2. Whispers of the Past. The next few hours were a blur. Evelyn moved through her duties in a daze, her mind consumed by the impossible reality of James Calloway's return. She checked on him frequently, monitoring his vital signs, changing his bandages, whispering words of comfort that felt hollow even to her own ears. He remained unconscious, his body struggling to recover from the trauma it had endured. Dr. Moreau, the chief surgeon, finally made his rounds. He was a gruff, no-nonsense man, his face etched with the weariness of years spent battling death and despair. Evelyn had always respected him, admired his unwavering dedication, but now she felt a sense of trepidation as she approached him. "Dr. Moreau," she began, her voice hesitant. "The new patient, the one brought in last night," he glanced at her, his eyebrows raised. "The one with the severe head trauma?" "Yes, I've seen him. A nasty case. Lucky to be alive." "His name," Evelyn continued, forcing the words out. "He says his name is James Calloway." Dr. Moreau frowned. "Calloway? Is that significant?" Evelyn swallowed hard. We had a Captain James Calloway here 3 months ago.
He died."
Dr. Moreau stared at her, his expression incredulous. "Died? Are you certain, Nurse Carter? We've all been under considerable strain. Mistakes can happen." "I'm certain," Evelyn insisted, her voice firm. "I was with him when he passed. I held his hand." Dr. Moreau studied her face, his gaze sharp and assessing. He knew her dedication, her unwavering professionalism. He knew she wasn't prone to flights of fancy. "This is extraordinary," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Let's have a look at him." They walked over to Calloway's cot, Evelyn's heart pounding in her chest. Dr. Moreau examined him thoroughly, his brow furrowed in concentration. He checked his pulse, listened to his breathing, carefully probed the wounds on his head. Finally, he straightened up, his expression grim. "His injuries are consistent with a severe concussion and multiple lacerations," he said. "There's some evidence of older, healed injuries as well, but nothing that would indicate, a previous death." Evelyn felt a wave of frustration. "But he looks exactly like him. The same face, the same build, even his voice. When he spoke, resemblances can be deceptive." "Nurse Carter," Dr. Moreau said, his voice softening slightly. "Grief can play tricks on the mind. You said you were close to the previous Captain Calloway?" Yes," Evelyn admitted, her voice barely a whisper. She had grown fond of the first James Calloway, admired his quiet strength, his gentle humor. His death had hit her harder than most. "It's understandable that you would see a resemblance," Dr. Moreau said, his tone sympathetic. But we must be rational. This man is alive. He needs our care. We'll do everything we can for him." He turned to leave, then paused, looking back at Evelyn. "Keep a close eye on him. Nurse Carter. If he regains consciousness, try to get more information from him. His identity, his unit, anything that can help us understand his situation." Evelyn nodded, her mind racing. Dr. Morrow's explanation, while logical, didn't sit right with her. She knew what she had seen, what she had felt. This wasn't just a resemblance. This was something more. As the day wore on, the ward became quieter, the constant flow of wounded slowing to a trickle. Evelyn sat beside Calloway's cot, watching him sleep. The flickering candlelight cast shadows across his face, making him look even more like the ghost of the man she had known. She reached out and gently touched his hand. His skin was warm, his pulse steady. She remembered the coldness of his hand when he had died, the stillness that had settled over him. This was different. This was life.
Who are you?
She whispered, her voice barely audible. Are you really James Calloway? Or are you someone else someone sent to haunt me? A sudden gust of wind rattled the tent flaps, and a chill ran down Evelyn's spine. She pulled her hand back, startled. It was just the wind, she told herself. Just the wind and her own exhausted imagination. But as she looked at him, at the familiar lines of his face, the faint scar above his eyebrow that she remembered so clearly, she couldn't shake the feeling that something extraordinary, something inexplicable, was happening. Whispers of the past, like the rustling of unseen wings, filled the air around her. And she knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that she wouldn't rest until she uncovered the truth. The man in front of her stirred, and she leaned forward, hoping for some sign, some word. But he remained locked in his healing slumber, leaving her only with the growing mystery. Chapter 3. A familiar touch. Days turned into nights, marked only by the rhythmic ebb and flow of pain and the constant struggle for survival in the ward. Evelyn continued to care for the man who called himself James Calloway, her every interaction with him a delicate dance between hope and disbelief. He remained mostly unconscious, his body slowly healing, but his mind still shrouded in a veil of amnesia. There were moments, brief flashes of lucidity, when he would open his eyes and look at her, his gaze filled with confusion and a flicker of something that might have been recognition. He would try to speak, his voice a raspy whisper, but the words wouldn't come, leaving him frustrated and exhausted. Evelyn would sit beside him, holding his hand, talking to him softly, telling him about the war, about the hospital, about the first James Calloway. She didn't know if he understood, if any of it penetrated the fog of his amnesia, but it felt important, a way to connect with him, to bridge the gap between the past and the present. One evening, as she was changing his bandages, her fingers brushed against a small, silver locket that hung around his neck. It was hidden beneath his shirt, tucked away as if for safekeeping. She hesitated, her fingers lingering on the cool metal. She knew she shouldn't pry, but curiosity, a deep-seated need to understand, overwhelmed her. Carefully, she opened the locket. Inside, there were 2 miniature portraits. One was of a young woman with dark hair and laughing eyes, a face that radiated joy and vitality. The other was of a man in uniform, a younger version of the James Calloway she had known, his expression serious, but with a hint of the same gentle humor she remembered. Evelyn felt a pang of sadness, a sharp ache in her chest. This was the life he had left behind, the life he couldn't remember. She closed the locket, tucking it back beneath his shirt, feeling a strange sense of intimacy, of sharing a secret with this man who was both familiar and a complete stranger. As she finished changing the bandages, his hand suddenly moved, his fingers wrapping around hers. It was a weak grip, but firm enough to startle her. She looked at him, his eyes still closed, but his breathing was more even, his expression less strained. "Evelyn," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Her heart skipped a beat. He had spoken her name. It was the first time he had said anything coherent, anything that connected him to her directly. "James?" she replied, her voice trembling. "Can you hear me?" His grip tightened slightly, and he opened his eyes. His gaze was clearer now, more focused. He looked at her, his eyes searching her face, as if trying to piece together a fragmented memory. I remember, he whispered, his voice strained. A gentle touch. He was looking at her hand, the one he was holding. Evelyn felt a shiver run down her spine. He was remembering her touch from the first time he had been here, from before he had died. I was fading, he continued, his voice growing stronger. But you held my hand, you wouldn't let go. Tears welled up in Evelyn's eyes. She had held his hand. That was true. She had stayed with him until the end, offering him comfort in his final moments. But how could he remember that? How could he remember something that had happened before he had returned? I don't understand, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. He closed his eyes again, his grip loosening. Neither do I, he murmured.
But I know you.
I trust you. And then he was gone again, slipping back into unconsciousness, leaving Evelyn with more questions than answers. But this time, there was a glimmer of hope, a fragile thread of connection that had been forged between them. He remembered.
He trusted.
And that, she realized, was enough to keep her going, to fuel her determination to unravel the mystery of his return. The familiar touch, the one he remembered, was the key. She just had to figure out how to unlock the door it opened. The locket, too, seemed important, but for now it would stay between the two of them. She wouldn't tell Dr. Moreau yet. Chapter 4. The Scars of Memory. The following days brought a gradual improvement in James's condition. He was awake more often, his mind clearer, his body stronger. He still couldn't remember his past, his life before the war, but fragments of memory were starting to surface, triggered by seemingly random events. A particular scent, a song hummed by one of the nurses, the distant sound of church bells. Each memory, however fleeting, was a piece of the puzzle, a clue to his identity. Evelyn was there to collect those pieces, to carefully record them, hoping to eventually assemble a coherent picture of the man he was. One afternoon, as she was helping him sit up in bed, he noticed a small, wooden carving of a bird on the windowsill. It was a simple thing, a robin, carved by one of the patients as a way to pass the time. James stared at it, his brow furrowed in concentration. I used to carve, he whispered, his voice filled with wonder. Wood birds. I remember the feel of the knife in my hand, the smell of the wood shavings. Evelyn smiled, encouraging him. You were good at it? He nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. My father taught me. We would sit on the porch on summer evenings and carve together. He closed his eyes, his expression wistful. The memory, so vivid for a moment, faded, leaving him with a sense of loss, of longing for something he couldn't quite grasp. Evelyn brought him a piece of wood and a small knife, hoping to stimulate his memory further. He took them eagerly, his fingers wrapping around the tools with a familiarity that surprised both of them. He began to carve, slowly at first, then with increasing confidence, his movements fluid and graceful. As she watched him, Evelyn noticed something else, a series of scars on his left forearm, partially hidden beneath the sleeve of his hospital gown. They were old scars, faded and white, but clearly visible. She hadn't noticed them before, perhaps because she had been so focused on his head injuries. She gently pushed back his sleeve, revealing the full extent of the scars. There were several of them, long and thin, running parallel to each other. They looked like knife wounds. James, she said softly, do you remember how you got these? He looked at his arm, his expression puzzled. No, he whispered. I don't. But they feel familiar. He touched the scars, his fingers tracing their contours. There was pain, he said, his voice strained. A lot of pain and anger. He closed his eyes, his body tensing. He was clearly struggling to remember, to push past the barriers in his mind. Evelyn held his hand, offering him silent support. It's all right, she said soothingly. Don't force it. It will come back to you in time. He opened his eyes, his gaze locking with hers. But what if it doesn't? He whispered, his voice filled with fear. What if I never remember who I am? Evelyn squeezed his hand, her heart aching for him. We'll figure it out together, she said, her voice firm. I promise you. We'll find the answers. The scars were a new mystery, a new layer to the puzzle of James Calloway. They spoke of a past filled with violence, with conflict, a past that was both separate from and intertwined with the war. Evelyn knew she had to be careful, to tread lightly. His mind was fragile, his memories fragmented. Pushing him too hard could be dangerous. But she also knew that she couldn't give up. She had to find the truth, not just for him, but for herself. She was starting to truly feel for the first time in years, and the locus of those emotions was this man. The scars of his memory were becoming her own, a shared burden that she was willing to carry, no matter the cost. Chapter 5. Between Two Worlds. As James grew stronger physically, the dichotomy between his two existences, the one he remembered in fragments and the one Evelyn knew, became increasingly apparent. He was, in essence, living between two worlds, a ghost of the past inhabiting a body that had experienced a different, yet strangely similar, present. He spoke often of the life he remembered in flashes, the small village where he grew up, the scent of his mother's baking, the laughter of his siblings. He remembered the woman in the locket, Sarah, his fiancée, with a heartbreaking clarity, recalling their stolen moments together, their dreams of a future that had been brutally cut short. But he also remembered the war, the trenches, the constant fear, the faces of his fallen comrades. These memories, however, were fragmented and disjointed, lacking the specific details, the names and dates that would definitively link him to the first James Calloway. Evelyn listened patiently, carefully piecing together the fragments, comparing them to what she knew of the first James Calloway. There were similarities, striking ones, but also discrepancies, subtle differences that kept her from fully accepting the impossible truth of his return. One evening, as they sat together in the quiet ward, James looked at her, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. "I feel like I'm living in someone else's life," he whispered. "Like I'm wearing a coat that doesn't quite fit." Evelyn understood. She felt it too, the unsettling dissonance between the man she had known and the man who was now sitting before her. "It's a difficult situation, James," she said gently. "You've been through a lot. It's understandable that you would feel confused. But I remember you," he said, his gaze locking with hers. "I remember your kindness, your compassion, your touch." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. Evelyn felt a jolt, a familiar warmth that spread through her chest. This was the connection, the undeniable link between the two worlds. "I remember holding your hand," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "When I was dying." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. He was remembering it again, that final moment, the moment that defied all logic, all reason. How is that possible?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He shook his head, his expression bewildered.
"I don't know," he said.
"But I know it's true. I felt you pulling me back, even when I was gone." Evelyn felt tears welling up in her eyes. She didn't understand it either, but she couldn't deny the truth of his words, the raw emotion in his voice. "There's something else," he said, his voice hesitant. "Something darker, something I'm afraid to remember." He was referring to the scars, Evelyn knew. The scars that spoke of a hidden past, a past filled with violence and pain. "It's all right," she said soothingly. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to." "But I need to," he said, his voice firm. "I need to understand what happened to me, who I really am." He looked at her, his eyes pleading. "Will you help me, Evelyn? Will you help me find the truth even if it's terrifying?" Evelyn squeezed his hand, her heart aching for him. She knew the risks, the potential dangers of uncovering his past. But she also knew that she couldn't abandon him, not now, not when he needed her most. "I will," she said, her voice unwavering. "I promise you. We'll face it together." The space between them, between their two worlds, felt smaller now, bridged by a shared determination, a growing bond that defied the boundaries of life and death. Evelyn knew that the journey ahead would be difficult, that the truth might be painful, but she was ready. She was ready to face whatever lay hidden in the shadows of his past, to help him reclaim his identity, even if it meant confronting the darkness that lurked within. The trust he placed in her was a weight, a precious burden she would bear, no matter the cost. The fear in his eyes was a mirror of her own, but his determination fueled hers. Chapter 6. Letters from Nowhere. A breakthrough came unexpectedly in the form of a small, battered package addressed to Captain James Calloway. It had been forwarded from his previous unit, a collection of letters and personal effects that had been gathered after his presumed death. Evelyn hesitated before bringing the package to James. She knew that it could contain painful reminders of his past, of the life he had lost. But she also knew that it might hold the key to his identity, the missing pieces of the puzzle that they had been searching for. She found him sitting by the window, gazing out at the rain-soaked landscape, his expression distant and melancholic. She placed the package on the table beside him, her hand lingering on the worn canvas. "This arrived for you," she said softly. "From your unit." He looked at the package, his eyes widening slightly. He reached out, his fingers tracing the faded writing on the address label. He seemed hesitant, almost afraid to open it. "It's all right," Evelyn said, encouraging him.
"Take your time."
He took a deep breath and slowly opened the package. Inside, there were several letters, tied together with a faded ribbon, a small, leather-bound journal, and a few photographs. He picked up the letters first, his hands trembling slightly. He unfolded one of them and began to read, his eyes scanning the handwritten words. Evelyn watched him, her heart aching for him. She could see the emotions flickering across his face: sadness, longing, confusion. He read through several letters, his expression growing increasingly pained. He put them down, his hands shaking. "They're from Sarah," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "My fiancé." Evelyn nodded, her throat tight. She remembered the portrait in the locket, the young woman with the laughing eyes. She writes about our plans," he continued, his voice barely audible. "Our wedding, our future, the life we were going to have." He closed his eyes, his body trembling. Evelyn reached out and took his hand, offering him silent comfort. "It's all right, James," she said softly. "It's all right to grieve." He opened his eyes, his gaze locking with hers. "But I don't remember writing back," he said, his voice filled with confusion. "I don't remember sending her anything." Evelyn frowned. That was strange. The first James Calloway had been a devoted letter writer, she remembered. He had written to Sarah regularly, his letters filled with love and longing. He picked up another letter, this one addressed to him in a different handwriting, a scrawling, almost illegible script. He unfolded it and began to read, his brow furrowed in concentration. As he read, his expression changed. The sadness and longing were replaced by something else: confusion, then disbelief, then fear. He looked up at Evelyn, his eyes wide and panicked. This isn't from Sarah," he whispered. "It's from someone else, someone I don't know." He handed her the letter, his hand trembling. Evelyn took it and began to read. The words were cryptic, filled with veiled threats and accusations. It spoke of a betrayal, a secret mission, a debt that needed to be repaid. "You know what you have to do," the letter concluded. "If you fail, there will be consequences for you," and for her. Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. This was something new, something that didn't fit with what she knew of the first James Calloway. This was a glimpse into a hidden world, a world of espionage and danger. Who wrote this?" she asked, her voice trembling. James shook his head, his expression bewildered. I don't know," he whispered. "But I think I'm in danger." The letters from nowhere had opened a Pandora's box, revealing a hidden layer to James's past, a layer that was far more complex and dangerous than Evelyn had ever imagined. The comfortable narrative she had been building, the one that mirrored the first James, was shattering. And now, the question was not just who he was, but what he had done and who was after him. The familiar fear in his eyes was now amplified, tinged with a new, sharper edge. Chapter 7. The Weight of Recognition. The cryptic letter hung between them, a tangible manifestation of the danger that now surrounded James. Evelyn reread it several times, trying to decipher its hidden meaning, to identify the sender and the nature of the threat. But the words remained elusive, a jumble of veiled accusations and menacing promises. She looked at James, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and confusion. He was vulnerable, exposed, his amnesia a shield that had been unexpectedly ripped away. "We need to show this to Dr. Morrow," she said, her voice firm. "He needs to know what's going on." James hesitated, his expression troubled. I don't know," he whispered. "I don't trust anyone except you." Evelyn understood his fear. He was adrift in a sea of uncertainty, surrounded by strangers, unsure of who to trust. But she knew that they couldn't handle this alone. They needed help, expertise, someone who could navigate the treacherous waters of wartime intelligence. "Dr. Moreau is a good man, James," she said gently. "He's dedicated to his patients. He'll help us." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "We'll do this together," she said, her voice unwavering. "I promise you, I won't let anything happen to you." He squeezed her hand, his grip tightening. "I trust you, Evelyn," he whispered. "I trust you more than anyone." They went to Dr. Morrow's office, the letter clutched tightly in Evelyn's hand. He listened intently as they explained the situation, his expression growing increasingly grim as he read the letter. "This is serious," he said, his voice grave. "This could be evidence of espionage, of treason." He looked at James, his gaze sharp and assessing. "Do you remember anything about this, Captain? Anything at all?" James shook his head, his expression frustrated. "No," he whispered. "It's like a blank wall. I can't see anything." Dr. Morrow sighed, his shoulders slumping. "We need to contact the authorities," he said. "Military intelligence. They need to investigate this." Evelyn felt a surge of fear. Bringing in military intelligence was a risky move. They were known for their ruthlessness, their unwavering dedication to the war effort. They wouldn't hesitate to interrogate James, to push him to the breaking point, regardless of his fragile mental state. "But he's not well," she protested. "He's still recovering. He can't handle that kind of pressure." Dr. Morrow looked at her, his expression sympathetic. "I understand your concerns, Nurse Carter," he said. "But we have no choice. This is a matter of national security." He paused, then added, his voice softening slightly. "I'll be there with him," he said. "I'll make sure they don't harm him. I'll protect him as best I can." The next few days were a blur of activity. Military intelligence officers arrived at the hospital, their faces stern and unyielding. They interrogated James for hours, their questions relentless and probing. Evelyn stayed by his side, offering him support and reassurance, trying to shield him from the worst of their scrutiny. The interrogation was grueling, exhausting. James struggled to answer their questions, his fragmented memories offering little in the way of concrete information. He grew increasingly agitated, his anxiety level soaring. One evening, after a particularly intense session, Evelyn found him sitting on his cot, his head in his hands, his body trembling. She sat beside him, her arm around his shoulders, offering him silent comfort. I can't do this anymore," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. I can't remember." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with despair. I'm useless, I'm a burden." Evelyn tightened her grip on him, her heart aching for him. "You're not useless, James," she said fiercely. "You're strong, you're brave, you're surviving." She pulled him closer, holding him tight. "We'll get through this," she said, her voice unwavering. "Together." As she held him, she felt a sudden shift in his body, a subtle stiffening. He looked up at her, his eyes widening, his expression changing from despair to recognition. "Evelyn," he whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "I remember something." He reached out and touched her face, his fingers tracing the contours of her cheek. The train station," he whispered. You were there, you were wearing a blue dress." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. He was remembering something from her past, something that had happened before they had ever met before the war. Something only she could know. The weight of recognition, the impossible truth of his return, crashed down on her. This wasn't just a resemblance, a trick of the mind. This was something far more profound, far more inexplicable. And it was terrifying. Chapter 8. A Dance of Shadows. The memory of the train station, so vivid and unexpected, hung between them like a shimmering mirage. Evelyn stared at James, her mind reeling, trying to make sense of what he had just said. The blue dress, the train station, it was a memory from years ago, from before the war, a fleeting encounter with a soldier she had never seen again. She remembered it clearly. She had been traveling to Paris to visit her sister, and she had seen him on the platform, a young officer, his face etched with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. He had smiled at her, a brief, fleeting smile, and then he had boarded the train, disappearing into the crowd. She had never forgotten that smile, that fleeting moment of connection. How could James possibly know about that? It was impossible. Unless James, she whispered, her voice trembling. How do you know about that? He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and wonder. I don't know, he said. It just came to me like a dream, but it felt real. He reached out and touched her hair, his fingers tracing the strands. You are so beautiful, he whispered. I couldn't take my eyes off you. Evelyn felt a shiver run down her spine. This was beyond anything she could have imagined. This was a connection that transcended time, that defied all logic and reason. I saw you too, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. I remember your smile. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to fade away. They were connected, bound by a shared memory, a moment in time that had somehow been imprinted on both of their souls. But the moment was fleeting. The reality of their situation, the danger that surrounded them, came crashing back. The military intelligence officers were still there, watching them, their faces inscrutable. Evelyn knew that she couldn't reveal this new revelation to them. They wouldn't understand. They would think she was mad, or worse, that she was somehow involved in whatever James was accused of. She had to protect him, to shield him from their scrutiny. But how? She decided to use the one advantage she had, her knowledge of the first James Calloway. She would use his memories, his experiences, to deflect the officers' questions, to lead them down a false trail. It was a dangerous game, a dance of shadows, where one wrong step could have disastrous consequences. But she was willing to risk it for him. During the next interrogation session, she subtly guided James, prompting him with details from the first James Calloway's life, helping him to construct a narrative that was plausible, yet ultimately misleading. She told him about his supposed childhood, his family, his friends, drawing on information she had gleaned from his letters and journals. She described his military training, his early deployments, his experiences in the trenches, weaving a tapestry of truth and fiction. James, his mind still fragile, his memories fragmented, followed her lead, his responses hesitant at first, then growing stronger as he embraced the role she had created for him. The officers, while still suspicious, were gradually convinced. They saw a wounded soldier, suffering from amnesia, struggling to recall his past. They saw a man who was broken, traumatized, but ultimately innocent. Evelyn's deception was working. But it was a precarious balance, a tightrope walk between truth and lies. She knew that she couldn't keep it up forever. Sooner or later, the officers would discover the truth. And then what? She didn't know. But she was determined to buy them as much time as possible, to find a way out of this impossible situation. She had to. Her heart, her very soul, was now inextricably linked to this man, this ghost of the past who had somehow returned to her. She would protect him, even if it meant sacrificing everything. The dance was dangerous, but she would continue, weaving a web of half-truths and carefully constructed lies, all for the sake of the man who remembered a blue dress she had worn years ago, a lifetime away. Chapter 9. The Price of Silence. The charade continued, a delicate balancing act that demanded constant vigilance and unwavering focus. Evelyn lived in a state of perpetual anxiety, her every action, every word, carefully calculated to protect James from the prying eyes of military intelligence. She knew that one slip-up, one inconsistency, could expose them both, leading to consequences she couldn't even bear to contemplate. The strain was beginning to take its toll. She found it increasingly difficult to sleep, her nights plagued by nightmares and a gnawing sense of dread. She lost weight, her appetite vanishing, replaced by a constant knot of tension in her stomach. But she couldn't falter. She had to be strong for James. He was relying on her, trusting her implicitly, and she couldn't let him down. He was slowly recovering, his physical wounds healing, his mind gradually regaining its clarity. But the amnesia persisted, a stubborn barrier that prevented him from accessing the memories that held the key to his identity and the danger that surrounded him. He was becoming increasingly frustrated, his inability to remember fueling his anxiety. He knew that something was wrong, that he was caught in a web of secrets and lies, but he couldn't grasp the details, the specifics that would make sense of it all. "I feel like I'm trapped in a maze," he confided in Evelyn one evening, his voice filled with despair. "I can see the walls around me, but I can't find the way out." Evelyn held his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "We'll find it together, James," she said, her voice unwavering. "I promise you." But even as she spoke the words, she felt a pang of doubt. She was running out of time, running out of options. The military intelligence officers were growing impatient, their suspicions rekindled by James's continued amnesia and the lack of concrete evidence to support his claims. They had started to focus their attention on Evelyn, questioning her more closely, probing for inconsistencies in her story. They suspected that she knew more than she was letting on, that she was somehow involved in James's deception. She knew that she couldn't maintain the charade much longer. She had to find a way to break free, to escape the suffocating pressure of their scrutiny. She considered telling Dr. Moreau the truth, revealing the impossible reality of James's return. But she hesitated, fearing his reaction. Would he believe her? Or would he think she was mad, complicit in some elaborate scheme? The risk was too great. She couldn't trust anyone, not yet. She had to find another way, a way to protect James and herself without exposing them to further danger. The price of silence was high, a constant burden that weighed heavily on her soul. But she was willing to pay it for him. He was her anchor, her reason for continuing, the one bright spot in a world consumed by darkness and despair. She would protect him, even if it meant sacrificing her own peace of mind, her own future. She had made a promise, a vow to keep him safe, and she would honor it, no matter the cost. The silence was deafening, but within it, her resolve only grew stronger. She would not break. She would not yield. She would find a way. The officers were closing in, but she would not let them win. Chapter 10. Echoes in the Trenches. A sudden, unexpected event shifted the balance of power, throwing Evelyn's carefully constructed world into disarray. A new wave of wounded soldiers arrived at the hospital, victims of a fierce battle that had raged near the front lines. Among them was a man who recognized James, a soldier who had served with him, who had witnessed his death. Evelyn was tending to a young soldier with a shrapnel wound when she heard a commotion near the entrance of the ward. She looked up and saw a group of officers surrounding a stretcher, their faces grim. On the stretcher lay a man, his face pale and drawn, his uniform covered in blood and mud. She heard him speak, his voice weak but clear. "Captain Calloway," he rasped. Is he here?" Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. She knew, with a sickening certainty, what was about to happen. The officers looked around the ward, their eyes searching. They spotted James, sitting on his cot, his expression confused. "You," one of the officers said, pointing at James. "Are you Captain James Calloway?" James nodded, his eyes widening slightly. "Yes," he said. "I am." The wounded soldier on the stretcher struggled to sit up, his face contorted in pain. "No," he whispered. That's not him, Captain Calloway. He died. I saw him fall." Evelyn felt a wave of dizziness, a sense of unreality that threatened to overwhelm her. The truth was out. The charade was over. The officers turned to James, their expressions hardening. "Who are you?" one of them demanded, his voice sharp and accusatory. James looked at them, his eyes filled with confusion and fear. I don't know," he whispered. "I can't remember." The officers turned to Evelyn, their gaze piercing. "You," one of them said, his voice low and menacing. "You knew, didn't you? You knew he wasn't Captain Calloway." Evelyn met their gaze, her chin held high. She knew that she couldn't deny it any longer. Yes, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. I knew. The officers surrounded her, their faces inches from hers.
Who is he?
One of them demanded. What is he involved in? Tell us the truth, or you will face the consequences. Evelyn closed her eyes, her mind racing. She had to protect James, even now, even when the truth was out. She had to find a way to shield him from their wrath. She took a deep breath and opened her eyes, her gaze locking with the lead officers. He's a patient, she said, her voice firm. He's suffering from amnesia. He doesn't know who he is. Don't lie to us, the officer snarled. We know he's involved in something dangerous. Evelyn shook her head. He's not involved in anything, she insisted. He's a victim just like all the other soldiers here. The officer grabbed her arm, his grip tightening. We'll see about that, he said. We're taking him in for questioning. And you're coming with us. Evelyn didn't resist. She knew that it was futile. She had lost. The echoes in the trenches, the whispers of the past, had finally caught up with them. She had failed to protect James. And now, they would both face the consequences. But even in defeat, she felt a strange sense of relief. The burden of silence, the weight of deception, had been lifted. The truth, however painful, was finally out in the open. And somehow, that gave her strength. She would face whatever came next, with courage and determination. She would not abandon James. She would stand by him, until the very end. Chapter 11. The Unspoken Promise. Evelyn and James were taken to a nearby military base, a stark, forbidding complex of concrete buildings and barbed wire fences. They were separated, placed in different holding cells, their fate hanging in the balance. Evelyn spent the night in a cold, damp room, her mind racing, her heart heavy with fear and uncertainty. She didn't know what was happening to James, whether he was being interrogated, tortured, or worse. The thought of him suffering, alone and afraid, was unbearable. She had failed him. She had promised to protect him, and she had failed. The next morning, she was brought before a panel of officers, their faces stern and unyielding. They questioned her relentlessly, their accusations sharp and accusatory. They accused her of aiding and abetting a spy, of obstructing justice, of treason. Evelyn denied the accusations, her voice firm and unwavering. She insisted that James was a victim, a soldier suffering from amnesia, a man who had lost his identity and his memory. But the officers didn't believe her. They presented her with evidence, fragments of information they had gathered from their investigation. They showed her the cryptic letter, the one that had arrived at the hospital. They showed her photographs of James, taken before his supposed death, photographs that showed him meeting with known enemy agents. Evelyn stared at the evidence, her mind reeling. It was damning, undeniable. It painted a picture of James as a traitor, a spy who had betrayed his country and his comrades. But she couldn't believe it. She knew James, knew his heart, his soul. He wasn't capable of such treachery. There had to be another explanation. She tried to explain, to tell them about the first James Calloway, about the impossible return, about the shared memories, the connection that transcended time and logic. But the officers dismissed her words as the ravings of a delusional woman, a woman in love with a traitor. They gave her one last chance to confess, to cooperate, to reveal James's true identity and his mission. They promised her leniency, a reduced sentence, if she would only tell them the truth. Evelyn hesitated. The temptation was strong. She could save herself, escape the harsh punishment that awaited her. But she couldn't betray James. She couldn't abandon him, not now, not when he needed her most. She had made a promise, an unspoken vow to protect him, and she would honor it, no matter the cost. She looked at the officers, her eyes filled with defiance. I have nothing to confess, she said, her voice unwavering. I have told you the truth. James Calloway is a victim. He is not a traitor. The officers exchanged glances, their expressions grim. They had made their decision. Very well, one of them said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. You have chosen your fate. Evelyn was sentenced to imprisonment, a harsh punishment for her perceived crimes. She was taken away, led back to her cell, her future uncertain, her heart heavy with despair. But even in her darkest hour, she felt a flicker of hope, a spark of defiance. She had kept her promise. She had protected James, to the best of her ability. And somehow, that gave her strength. She didn't know what the future held, what awaited her in the cold, dark confines of her prison. But she knew one thing: she would never regret her decision. She would never betray the man she loved, the man who had somehow returned from the dead, the man who had captured her heart and her soul. The unspoken promise, the vow she had made, was stronger than any fear, any threat. It was a bond that could not be broken, a love that would endure, even in the face of adversity. The future was bleak, but her spirit remained unbroken. Chapter 12. Beneath a Shattered Sky. The prison was a bleak, desolate place, a world of stone walls and iron bars, of silence and despair. Evelyn was stripped of her identity, her name replaced by a number, her uniform by a coarse, shapeless gown. She was alone, isolated, cut off from the world she knew. The days were long and monotonous, filled with the drudgery of prison life, the endless chores, the meager meals, the constant surveillance. The nights were worse, haunted by nightmares and the gnawing fear of the unknown. She thought of James constantly, wondering what had happened to him, whether he was still alive, whether he remembered her. The thought of him suffering, alone and afraid, was a constant torment, a weight that pressed down on her soul. She clung to the memories of their time together, the brief moments of connection, the shared laughter, the unspoken promise that bound them together. Those memories were her lifeline, her source of strength, the one thing that kept her from succumbing to despair. One day, she received a visit from an unexpected guest, Dr. Morrow. He had managed to pull some strings to gain access to the prison to see her. He looked older, wearier, his face etched with concern. He sat across from her, separated by a thick glass partition, his voice barely audible through the small speaker. "Evelyn," he said, his voice filled with sadness. "I'm so sorry, I never imagined." Evelyn shook her head. "It's not your fault, doctor," she said, her voice hoarse. "You did what you thought was right." "I should have believed you," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I should have trusted you." He told her what had happened to James. He had been interrogated relentlessly, tortured, pushed to the breaking point. But he had refused to confess, to reveal any information about his supposed mission. Eventually, he had been court-martialed, convicted of treason, and executed. Evelyn felt a wave of grief, a crushing blow that took her breath away. James gone, she had failed him. She had promised to protect him, and she had failed. She closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. She had lost everything. Her freedom, her future, the man she loved. There's something else," Dr. Morrow said, his voice hesitant. "Something strange, something I don't understand." He told her that after James's execution, his body had disappeared. Vanished. Without a trace. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. Disappeared? How was that possible? They don't know where he is," Dr. Morrow continued. "They searched everywhere, but he's gone." A flicker of hope, a tiny spark, ignited within Evelyn's heart. Gone? Could it be? Could he have somehow escaped? It was a long shot, an impossible dream. But it was enough to keep her going, to give her a reason to hope. "Thank you, doctor," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you for telling me." Dr. Morrow left, leaving Evelyn alone with her thoughts, her grief, and a fragile glimmer of hope. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing: she would never give up. She would never stop searching for James, for the truth, for a way to clear his name. She looked up at the small, barred window, at the shattered sky above, a sky that mirrored the broken pieces of her life. But even beneath that shattered sky, there was a glimmer of light, a faint ray of hope that refused to be extinguished. James might be gone, but he was not forgotten. And as long as she lived, she would keep his memory alive. She would fight for his honor. She would search for him until her last breath. The prison walls might confine her body, but they could not contain her spirit, her love, her unwavering determination. Chapter 13. The face of deception. Years passed. The war ended. The world slowly began to heal, but Evelyn remained imprisoned, her sentence unchanged, her spirit unbroken. She had adapted to the harsh realities of prison life, finding solace in small acts of kindness, in the shared camaraderie of her fellow inmates. She had become a source of strength and comfort to the other women, offering them a listening ear, a shoulder to cry on, a word of encouragement. She had learned to survive, to endure, to find meaning in the face of adversity. One day, a new prisoner arrived, a woman named Marie, who had been convicted of collaborating with the enemy. She was young, beautiful, and terrified, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. Evelyn took Marie under her wing, offering her protection and support, helping her to navigate the treacherous world of the prison. She saw in Marie a reflection of her younger self, a woman caught in the crossfire of war, a victim of circumstance. As they grew closer, Marie began to confide in Evelyn, sharing her story, her secrets, her fears. She told Evelyn about her involvement with a German officer, a man she had loved, a man who had promised her the world. She had been naive, foolish, blinded by love. She had believed his lies, his promises, his deceptions. She had helped him, provided him with information, betrayed her country. She regretted her actions, her betrayal, her mistakes. She was paying the price for her sins, her heart heavy with guilt and remorse. As Marie spoke, Evelyn listened intently, her mind racing. There was something familiar about Marie's story, something that resonated with her own experiences, with the mystery of James Calloway. One evening, as they sat together in their cell, Marie showed Evelyn a photograph, a small, faded image of the German officer she had loved. She had kept it hidden, a secret reminder of her past, of the man who had betrayed her. Evelyn took the photograph, her hand trembling. She stared at the face of the German officer, her eyes widening in disbelief. It was him, James Calloway, but different. Older, harder, his eyes devoid of the warmth, the kindness she remembered. This was the face of deception, the face of the man who had played Marie, the man who had used her, the man who had betrayed his country. Evelyn felt a wave of nausea, a sickening realization that washed over her. James a traitor, it couldn't be true. But the evidence was there, staring her in the face. She looked at Marie, her heart aching for her. She saw the pain in her eyes, the betrayal, the disillusionment. She saw a reflection of her own pain, her own heartbreak. He told me his name was Klaus, Marie whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Klaus Richter. Evelyn closed her eyes, her mind reeling. Klaus Richter. James Calloway, 2 names, 2 identities, 1 man. A master of deception, a spy who had played them all, a man who had lived a double life, a life of lies and betrayal. The truth was finally revealed, a truth that was far more complex, far more painful than she could ever have imagined. James had not returned from the dead. He had never died in the first place. It had all been a lie, a carefully constructed deception, a charade designed to protect his true identity, his true mission. The face of deception, the one she had loved, was a mask, hiding a reality she could barely comprehend. And now, she had to decide what to do with this devastating knowledge. The years of imprisonment, the sacrifice, all based on a lie. Chapter 14. A Trail of Lost Souls. The revelation of James's true identity, his life as a double agent, shattered Evelyn's world. The man she had loved, the man she had sacrificed everything for, was a phantom, a carefully crafted illusion. The pain of betrayal was compounded by the crushing weight of her wasted years, the injustice of her imprisonment. She confronted Marie, demanding answers, seeking to understand the full extent of James's, or rather, Klaus's deception. Marie, racked with guilt and shame, revealed everything she knew. Klaus had been a master manipulator, a skilled liar who had used her and countless others to further his espionage activities. He had played on their vulnerabilities, their hopes, their dreams, weaving a web of lies that had ensnared them all. He had used Evelyn's genuine grief and belief in his return as a perfect cover, exploiting her compassion and loyalty to shield his true identity. Marie had learned, after his supposed execution, that he had escaped, disappearing into the shadows, leaving behind a trail of lost souls, broken hearts, and ruined lives. He had used a network of contacts, fellow spies, and collaborators to facilitate his escape, assuming a new identity, continuing his clandestine work. Evelyn listened, her heart heavy with sorrow and a growing sense of anger. She had been a fool, blinded by love, manipulated by a master of deception. But she was no longer the naive, grieving nurse she had once been. She was a survivor, hardened by years of imprisonment, her spirit tempered by adversity. She decided that she couldn't remain silent any longer. She had to expose Klaus, to reveal his treachery, to bring him to justice. She had to do it for herself, for Marie, for all the other victims of his deception. She began to gather evidence, meticulously documenting everything she knew, everything Marie had told her. She wrote letters to former colleagues, to military officials, to anyone who might be able to help her. She smuggled the letters out of the prison, using a network of contacts she had established among the other inmates. It was a dangerous game, a risky undertaking. If she were caught, she would face severe punishment, perhaps even execution. But she was willing to risk it, for the sake of justice, for the sake of truth. Her efforts eventually paid off. One of her letters reached a former military intelligence officer who had been involved in the original investigation of James Calloway. He had always harbored doubts about the case, suspecting that there was more to the story than had been revealed. He was intrigued by Evelyn's letter, by the new evidence she presented. He began his own investigation, quietly, discreetly, following the trail of lost souls that Klaus had left behind. He discovered a pattern of deception, a network of lies that spanned years, continents, and multiple identities. He uncovered evidence of Klaus's involvement in numerous acts of espionage, of sabotage, of betrayal. He realized that Evelyn was telling the truth, that she had been a victim, a pawn in a much larger game. He decided to help her, to bring Klaus to justice, to clear her name. The trail was cold, but it was there, a faint path leading through the wreckage of shattered lives. And Evelyn, armed with the truth and a burning desire for justice, was ready to follow it, no matter where it led. The years of silence were over. The time for reckoning had come. Chapter 15. The Heart's Betrayal. The investigation gained momentum, fueled by Evelyn's unwavering determination and the former intelligence officer's relentless pursuit of the truth. They uncovered a network of collaborators, informants, and accomplices, all linked to Klaus Richter, all implicated in his web of deceit. They tracked his movements across Europe, following a trail of false identities, aliases, and fabricated documents. They discovered that he had continued his espionage activities after the war, working for various intelligence agencies, betraying secrets, manipulating events, profiting from chaos. He was a chameleon, a master of disguise, constantly changing his appearance, his identity, his allegiance. He was elusive, a ghost in the machine, always one step ahead of his pursuers. But Evelyn and the officer were closing in. They had gathered enough evidence to prove his guilt, to expose his treachery, to bring him to justice. They learned that Klaus was currently living in Argentina under the assumed name of Ricardo Vargas, a wealthy businessman with connections to powerful political figures. He was living a life of luxury, enjoying the fruits of his betrayal, seemingly untouchable. Evelyn was determined to confront him, to face him, to make him pay for his crimes. She knew that it was a dangerous undertaking, that he was a ruthless, cunning adversary. But she was not afraid. She had nothing left to lose. She convinced the officer to help her travel to Argentina, to track down Klaus, to bring him to justice. It was a risky plan, a long shot, but she was willing to take the chance. They arrived in Buenos Aires, a bustling, vibrant city, a world away from the cold, desolate prison where Evelyn had spent so many years. She felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation, a sense of anticipation and dread. They began their search, quietly, discreetly, using their contacts, their informants, their intuition. They followed leads, tracked down rumors, pieced together fragments of information. They eventually located Klaus, living in a luxurious villa on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by bodyguards, protected by his wealth and influence. Evelyn knew that she couldn't simply walk up to him and confront him. He would recognize her. He would escape. He would disappear again. She had to be cunning, to be strategic, to be as ruthless as he was. She had to use his own tactics against him. She devised a plan, a daring, audacious scheme to lure him into a trap, to expose him, to bring him down. It was a dangerous plan, a gamble, but she was willing to risk it. She knew that she was facing the ultimate betrayal, the betrayal of the heart, the betrayal of the man she had once loved. But she was no longer that naive, trusting woman. She was a survivor, a warrior, a woman seeking justice. She was ready to face him, to confront him, to make him pay for his sins. The heart's betrayal had fueled her, sharpened her resolve, transformed her into a force to be reckoned with. She would not be denied. She would not be defeated. She would have her revenge. The stage was set. The final act was about to begin. Chapter 16. The Edge of Revelation. Evelyn's plan was intricate, relying on deception and misdirection, mirroring the tactics Klaus himself had employed. She used her knowledge of his past, his weaknesses, his predilections, to craft a scenario that would draw him out, expose him, and ultimately, trap him. She enlisted the help of Marie, who had been released from prison and was now living in Buenos Aires, seeking anonymity and redemption. Marie, initially hesitant, agreed to participate, driven by a desire for justice and a need to atone for her past mistakes. Together, they created a false identity for Evelyn, posing as a wealthy widow with connections to European intelligence agencies. They fabricated documents, established contacts, and spread rumors, carefully constructing a web of intrigue that would pique Klaus's interest. They knew that he was always looking for new opportunities, new sources of information, new ways to profit from chaos. They presented themselves as a potential asset, a valuable source of intelligence, a pawn in his game. The plan worked. Klaus, ever the opportunist, took the bait. He arranged a meeting with Evelyn, using his alias, Ricardo Vargas, his charm and charisma masking his true nature. Evelyn, disguised and using a false name, met him in a secluded cafe, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw him across the room, his face older, harder, but still recognizable. The man she had loved, the man who had betrayed her, was sitting just a few feet away. She felt a surge of conflicting emotions: anger, hatred, sadness, and a strange, lingering sense of longing. She had to suppress her emotions, to focus on her mission, to execute her plan. They engaged in a carefully choreographed conversation, Evelyn playing the role of the naive, wealthy widow, Klaus playing the role of the charming, sophisticated businessman. They spoke of politics, of espionage, of secrets, Evelyn subtly dropping hints, leading him on, drawing him closer to the trap. He was cautious, suspicious, always probing, always testing. But Evelyn was prepared. She had anticipated his questions, his doubts, his maneuvers. She countered his every move, maintaining her composure, her facade, her deception. The tension in the room was palpable, a silent battle of wits, a dance of deception. Evelyn knew that one wrong step, one slip-up, could expose her, could ruin everything. She gradually steered the conversation towards his past, towards his wartime activities, towards his identity as James Calloway. She dropped subtle hints, mentioned names, places, events that only he would know. He became increasingly agitated, his eyes narrowing, his charm fading. He realized that she knew more than she was letting on, that she was not who she claimed to be. He tried to deny it, to deflect her accusations, to maintain his facade. But Evelyn was relentless. She presented him with evidence, with photographs, with documents, with Marie's testimony. He was cornered, trapped, exposed. His carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. He finally broke, his composure shattering, his true nature revealed. He confessed to his crimes, to his espionage, to his betrayal. He admitted that he was Klaus Richter, that he had used Evelyn, that he had manipulated everyone around him. The revelation hung in the air, a stark and brutal truth. The game was over. The trap had been sprung. And standing near enough to be a witness, but far enough that she won't draw suspicion, was Marie. The edge of revelation was sharp, cutting through the years of lies and deception. Evelyn had finally achieved her goal. She had exposed Klaus. She had brought him to justice. Chapter 17. Where Truth Lies Bleeding. With Klaus's confession, the carefully constructed facade he had maintained for years crumbled, revealing the ruthless spy beneath. The authorities, alerted by Evelyn's intelligence contact, moved in swiftly, arresting him at the cafe. The scene was chaotic, a flurry of activity as Klaus, realizing he was cornered, attempted to resist, his face contorted in a mixture of rage and desperation. Evelyn watched, a strange detachment washing over her. The man she had once loved, the ghost who had haunted her for years, was now being dragged away, his cries of denial echoing in the sudden silence of the cafe. The victory felt hollow, tinged with a profound sadness that she couldn't quite shake. Marie, standing nearby, met Evelyn's gaze. There were tears in her eyes, but also a sense of relief, a weight lifted. They had both been victims of Klaus's deception, but they had also found a strange, shared strength in their mutual betrayal. In the aftermath, Evelyn cooperated fully with the authorities, providing them with a wealth of information about Klaus's espionage activities, his network of contacts, and his numerous crimes. Her testimony, along with Marie's and the evidence gathered by the intelligence officer, ensured that Klaus, or rather, James Calloway, alias Klaus Richter, alias Ricardo Vargas, would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The legal proceedings were lengthy and complex, spanning multiple countries and jurisdictions. Evelyn was called to testify, recounting her story, her experiences, her betrayal. She spoke with clarity and conviction, her voice unwavering, her spirit unbroken. She was finally exonerated, her name cleared, her sentence overturned. She was free, after years of unjust imprisonment, a victim of war, of deception, of a love that had turned out to be a cruel illusion. But freedom came at a price. The scars of her past, the emotional wounds inflicted by Klaus's betrayal, remained. She had lost years of her life, her career, her reputation, all because of a lie. She returned to France, to the field hospital where it had all begun, a place that held both painful memories and a strange sense of belonging. She found that much had changed. The war was over. The hospital was being decommissioned. The staff dispersed. Dr. Moreau was gone, retired, his health failing. Many of the other nurses she had known had moved on, married, started families, their lives taking different paths. Evelyn felt like a ghost herself, a relic of a bygone era, a survivor of a war that had left its mark on everyone and everything. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to, her future uncertain. She wandered through the empty wards, the silent corridors, the deserted grounds, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. She remembered the chaos, the pain, the suffering, but also the camaraderie, the compassion, the resilience of the human spirit. She stood in the ward where she had first met James Calloway, the place where the deception had begun, where her life had been irrevocably altered. She looked at the empty cot, the place where he had lain, where she had held his hand, where she had believed in his return. The truth lay bleeding there, in the silence, in the emptiness, in the memories that haunted her. But she was no longer afraid. She had faced the truth. She had confronted her demons. She had found her strength. The location was both a tomb and a birthplace. A tomb of a life she had believed in, a birthplace of a new, stronger her. She had survived. She had endured. And now, she had to find a way to rebuild her life, to find a new purpose to move forward. Chapter 18. A Love Rekindled. Evelyn decided to stay in France, drawn to the familiar landscape, the memories, both bitter and sweet, that lingered in the air. She found a small cottage near the village where the field hospital had once stood, a quiet, secluded place where she could begin to rebuild her life. She took a job as a nurse in a local clinic, caring for the sick and injured, finding solace in the familiar routine, the simple act of helping others. She was no longer the naive, idealistic young woman she had been before the war. She was older, wiser, her heart scarred, her spirit tempered by adversity. But she was also stronger, more resilient, more compassionate. She had learned the value of life, the importance of human connection, the power of forgiveness. She made new friends, built new relationships, slowly, cautiously, allowing herself to trust again, to open her heart to the possibility of happiness. She found comfort in the simple pleasures of life, the warmth of the sun on her skin, the beauty of the countryside, the laughter of children playing in the village square. One day, a new patient arrived at the clinic, an elderly man named Jean-Luc, who had been injured in a farming accident. He was gruff and taciturn, his face etched with the hardships of a long life, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. Evelyn tended to his wounds, her touch gentle, her voice soothing. She saw in him a reflection of her own pain, her own loneliness, her own struggle to find meaning in a world that had often been cruel and unforgiving. As she cared for him, they began to talk, to share their stories, their experiences, their losses. Jean-Luc had lost his wife many years ago, a grief that he had never fully overcome. He had lived alone, isolated, his heart closed off to the world. Evelyn told him about her past, about her imprisonment, about her betrayal, about the man she had once loved. She spoke without bitterness or resentment, her voice filled with a quiet acceptance, a hard-won understanding. Jean-Luc listened intently, his eyes filled with compassion. He saw in Evelyn a kindred spirit, a woman who had endured great suffering, but who had also found the strength to survive, to persevere. They formed a bond, a connection based on shared loss, shared pain, shared resilience. They found comfort in each other's company, solace in their shared silence, strength in their mutual understanding. Slowly, gradually, their friendship deepened, blossoming into something more. They discovered a shared love for the simple things in life: gardening, cooking, reading, walking in the countryside. They spent hours together, talking, laughing, sharing their memories, their dreams, their hopes. They found a sense of peace, of belonging, of companionship that neither of them had expected to find again. Jean-Luc was not James. He was a different man with a different past, a different temperament. But he was kind, gentle, compassionate, and he cared for Evelyn deeply, unconditionally. He helped her to heal, to overcome her past, to embrace the present, to look forward to the future. He showed her that love could be found again, even after great loss, even after profound betrayal. Evelyn, in turn, helped Jean-Luc to open his heart again, to embrace life, to find joy in the simple moments, to overcome his grief. She showed him that it was possible to love again, to trust again, to find happiness even in the twilight of his years. Their love was not a passionate, fiery romance, but a quiet, gentle, enduring companionship, a bond forged in shared experience, mutual respect, and a deep, abiding affection. It was a love rekindled, a flame that had been dimmed by adversity, but that now burned brightly, steadily, illuminating their lives. It was a second chance, a new beginning, a testament to the resilience of the human heart. It wasn't the explosive love of youth, but a mature, deep connection that promised peace and contentment. Chapter 19. The Final Stand. Years passed, and Evelyn and Jean-Luc built a life together, a quiet, peaceful existence filled with simple joys and shared companionship. They tended their garden, cared for their animals, and enjoyed the company of their friends and neighbors. The scars of the past remained, but they had faded, replaced by a sense of contentment and a deep appreciation for the present. One day, a letter arrived, an official-looking document from the British government. Evelyn opened it with trembling hands, her heart pounding in her chest. It was a formal apology, a recognition of the injustice she had suffered, a full pardon for all the charges against her. The letter also contained information about Klaus Richter, alias James Calloway. He had died in prison, succumbing to a long illness. The news brought a strange mixture of relief and sadness. The chapter was finally closed, the ghost of the past laid to rest. Evelyn shared the news with Jean-Luc, his hand clasping hers in silent support. They had both lived through so much, endured so much pain and loss. But they had found each other, and that was all that mattered. A few weeks later, another letter arrived, this one from a lawyer in Argentina. It informed Evelyn that she was the beneficiary of a substantial inheritance from a deceased client, a Ricardo Vargas. It was Klaus's final act, a belated attempt at atonement, a way of making amends for the harm he had caused. Evelyn was initially reluctant to accept the inheritance, the money tainted by his betrayal. But Jean-Luc convinced her to use it for good, to help others, to create something positive out of the darkness of the past. They decided to establish a foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to helping victims of war, of injustice, of betrayal. They named it the Phoenix Foundation, a symbol of rebirth, of resilience, of hope. The foundation flourished, providing support, assistance, and advocacy for those who had been marginalized, forgotten, or wronged. Evelyn poured her heart and soul into the work, finding purpose and meaning in helping others, in making a difference in the world. She became a voice for the voiceless, a champion for the oppressed, a beacon of hope for those who had lost their way. She traveled the world, speaking out against injustice, sharing her story, inspiring others to overcome adversity. She received numerous awards and accolades for her humanitarian work, her courage, her resilience. But the greatest reward was the knowledge that she was making a difference, that she was helping to heal the wounds of war, to build a better future. One evening, as she and Jean-Luc sat on their porch, watching the sunset over the fields, Evelyn felt a sense of peace, of fulfillment, of gratitude. She had come full circle, her life a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. She had faced betrayal, imprisonment, loss, and despair. But she had also found love, friendship, purpose, and redemption. She had risen from the ashes of her past, like a phoenix, stronger, wiser, more compassionate. She looked at Jean-Luc, his hand in hers, his eyes filled with love and admiration. They had found each other in the aftermath of tragedy, two broken souls who had helped each other to heal, to find happiness again. This was her final stand, her ultimate victory. She had overcome the darkness. She had embraced the light. She had found her peace. The war had shaped her, but it had not defined her. She was a survivor, a warrior, a woman of strength and grace. She had found love. She had built something meaningful in a world that had once seemed filled only with despair. The life they shared, the foundation, the future, it was all a quiet rebellion against the horrors she had seen. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of War. Evelyn's work with the Phoenix Foundation took her to many places scarred by conflict, allowing her to confront the lingering consequences of war and offer solace to those affected. She found a profound sense of purpose in this work, a way to transform her own pain into a force for healing and change. Jean-Luc remained her steadfast companion, his quiet strength and unwavering support a constant source of comfort. One particularly poignant journey took her back to the Somme, the site of the brutal battles that had defined her early life and set in motion the chain of events that led to her imprisonment. The landscape was still scarred, the earth holding the memories of countless lives lost. Standing there, amidst the rolling fields and quiet memorials, Evelyn felt a deep connection to the past, a reckoning with the ghosts that had haunted her for so long. She visited the field hospital site, now overgrown with wildflowers, a stark contrast to the chaotic scene she remembered. The canvas tents, the cries of the wounded, the constant presence of death, all were gone, replaced by a serene, almost ethereal beauty. It was here, amidst the ghosts of the past, that she finally felt a sense of closure. She spoke at a memorial service, sharing her story with a new generation, urging them to remember the lessons of war, to strive for peace, to never forget the human cost of conflict. Her words resonated deeply, touching the hearts of those who listened, a testament to her resilience and her unwavering commitment to a better world. Later that evening, as she walked alone through the fields, she came across a small, forgotten cemetery, a place where soldiers from both sides of the conflict were buried. She noticed a simple wooden cross, bearing the name James Calloway. It was not the elaborate marker of an officer, but a humble grave, almost lost among the others. She knelt beside it, her heart filled with a complex mixture of emotions: sadness, regret, forgiveness, and a lingering sense of wonder. Was this the real James Calloway? The one she had nursed? The one she had held as he died? Or was it just another soldier, a casualty of war, a life cut short? She realized that it didn't matter. The truth, in its many forms, had been revealed. The lies, the deceptions, the betrayals, all had been exposed. What remained was the enduring power of love, of compassion, of the human spirit. She placed a single wildflower on the grave, a symbol of remembrance, of respect, of hope. She whispered a silent prayer for all the lost souls, for all the victims of war, for all those who had suffered and endured. As she walked away, she felt a sense of peace, a feeling of lightness that she hadn't experienced in years. The reckoning of war was complete. She had confronted her past. She had made peace with her demons. She had found her purpose. She returned to Jean-Luc, their cottage, their quiet life. The foundation continued to thrive, a testament to their shared commitment to healing and hope. Evelyn, though older and wearier, found renewed strength in her work, her voice carrying the weight of experience and the unwavering belief in a better future. The war had taken much from her, but it had also given her something precious, the understanding of the true value of life, of love, of forgiveness. The reckoning was not just of the war itself, but of all the ripples it had sent through her life, finally settling into a calm, reflective pool. Epilogue. The years that followed were a testament to the quiet strength of a life rebuilt. Evelyn and Jean-Luc lived simply, their days filled with the gentle rhythm of rural life. The Phoenix Foundation continued to grow, its reach expanding to touch countless lives affected by conflict and injustice. Evelyn, though she gradually stepped back from its day-to-day operations, remained its guiding spirit, her wisdom and compassion shaping its mission. She often thought of James Calloway, of Klaus Richter, the man who had so profoundly altered the course of her life. The anger and betrayal had faded, replaced by a complex understanding of the human capacity for both good and evil, the choices we make, and the consequences that follow. She had forgiven him, not for his sake, but for her own. Jean-Luc passed away peacefully in his sleep, his hand clasped in Evelyn's. His loss was a profound blow, but she found solace in the memories of their years together, the quiet love they had shared, the life they had built. She carried on, her spirit undimmed, her commitment to the Phoenix Foundation unwavering. Evelyn lived to a remarkable age, witnessing the world change in ways she could never have imagined. She saw the rise and fall of nations, the advent of new technologies, the ongoing struggle for peace and justice. She remained a beacon of hope, a symbol of resilience, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. In her final days, she was surrounded by friends, colleagues, and those whose lives she had touched. She spoke of the importance of forgiveness, of compassion, of never giving up hope. She remembered the war, the pain, the loss, but she also remembered the love, the friendship, the strength she had found within herself. As she closed her eyes for the last time, she saw a vision, a fleeting image of a train station, a young soldier smiling at her, a blue dress. It was a memory, a dream, a whisper from the past. And then there was only peace. Evelyn Carter's legacy lived on, in the Phoenix Foundation, in the lives she had touched, in the hearts of those who remembered her. She was a woman who had been shaped by war, but not defined by it. She was a survivor, a healer, a beacon of hope in a world that desperately needed it. Her story was a testament to the enduring power of love, of forgiveness, of the human spirit to rise above adversity and create a better world. She had lived, she had loved, she had endured, and in the end, she had found her peace. The long journey was over, and the quiet rest, well earned. The end.